we have in this room, as I look around, a number of people who could easily be sitting on this panel. There's a great deal of expertise on these subjects here, and I invite you to start exploring the greater depth of what was presented in the panel through discussion. I'll take questions. It's fair game to ask for amplification. I, for one, have been feeling bad ever since I told Richard that he couldn't talk about Solyndra because I'm dying to hear about it. So anybody that wants to ask him to expound on that particular case is welcome to do so. But I'll take a few questions and then ask the speakers to respond. If you could identify yourself as you intervene, I'll start with Thomas.
Thank you. I'm Tom Brewer. I'm a Schiller Foundation Research Fellow in Germany. My question is there a way for trade law to adequately take into account market failures, which economists see as a central justification for subsidies, especially in renewable energies? Is there a way for trade law to treat market failures as a legitimate justification for subsidies?
I mean, I don't see any problem with the support for renewable energy as long as the power producer can use equipment from any part of the world, because that would probably be non-discriminatory. Now, every country has to have renewable power. It has to provide some support to the local producer. Now, what happens if the question was, it's just a hypothetical example, if it's electricity that is traded across the border, would the US have to provide a similar level of subsidy to Canadian electricity that was imported? So, I mean, here you see, would that be a fair justification, especially if conditions differed from Canada, between Canada and the US?
I can give you one example. Nagoya Protocol have been adopted last year, since 1 year ago. Nagoya Protocol as additional protocol for CBD on access and sharing benefit. It is access and sharing benefit. It is economical initiative. It is not really legal initiative. Why? Because the political pressure, and this is the wish of other part. But my question is about multilateralism. All agreement on environment are multilateralism, such as WTO is a multilateral international organizations. What is the advantage of multilateralism, bilateralism? IPR, for example, intellectual property rights, need always uniformization and harmonization. But there is any advantage on multilateral agreements, multilateralism? Thank you.
Including in the SCM agreement, actually enable the problem concerning local content subsidies.
We had two specific questions, or three, devoted to Luca and Richard, but some more general questions. If the presenters want to respond to those, I'll give them a chance, but let's start with Richard.
To do it. Basically, these are generally done at the country level, almost always, because it's the country that's granting the incentive or the subsidy. Generally, these should be set depending on the purpose of the endeavor. One can look at tax incentives to foreign investment, for example, and the literature on those. And generally, I think they tend to be overly generous relative to the benefit that one gets from increased inflows from foreign direct investment. So maybe there's an area where the sunset clauses could be shortened. In other countries, tax advantages to research and development of interest to this particular group, I think, tend to be rather enduring and long in action, and that may not be a bad thing, because you may want to make sure that R&D is perpetually incentivized. I think the more you narrow things down and the more you are focused on particular activities, the more clearly you can define the purpose and therefore the appropriateness of the length of the subsidies that should be endeavored. So that's the answer.
There's been some commentators, I'm referring particularly to Alan Sachs, he's both lawyer and economist, that have been suggesting how difficult it is when you determine whether you have a subsidy or not to establish whether you have a benefit, because if you start to have a very comprehensive economic analysis of all the possible interventions, positive, negatives, taxes, regulation that you have out there, then it's quite difficult, to pick out, that specific intervention at each should say, oh, this one is conferring a benefit. You should carry out a more comprehensive analysis. Assuming that you can do something like that in the legal framework that we have, in that context, you might take into account possibly the correcting purpose or nature of the subsidy. What is the problem? That Alan Sykes himself recognizes that this is something which is not practical. You cannot really have overcharge the benefit, the legal benefit analysis with all these kind of inquiries. It is already too much difficult as it is, but that could be one place hypothetically. Another place could be specificity test. But again here, I mean, if you manage to design your intervention in such a way that it is sufficiently neutral, sufficiently even-handed in its application, but then you have a problem, because I assume, not being an economist, I assume that if you want to target a market failure, you need to have something which is a targeted intervention. So again, this is not the place to look at. So the benefit analysis could be hypothetically, but I don't buy the argument in practical terms. So the only natural place, which is basically also what happens in European stated law, is unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because we don't have that in the WTO, is justifications, legal justifications, like non-actionability in the past. That's the only place where you can really address market failures, other legitimate objectives, and create, tailor, design a discipline around that. Other than that, the answer is probably not. Second question, I got the scenario, the hypothetical or not so hypothetical scenario. I'm not sure that I got the question. I will try to answer on the basis of what I got. And if I'm wrong, please correct me, and I'll try to be clearer. You were assuming that you might have two types of subsidy. One subsidy to direct subsidy to energy, to the production of energy, and the other subsidy, it's a local consent subsidy. So basically, it's a subsidy to a technology input which is then used in order to produce energy. As I very briefly said before, the legal treatment might be very different, because production subsidy is substantially permitted but actionable, whereas local content subsidies are prohibited. Let's assume that we have trade in electricity, because that's an assumption. In most of the cases, you have trade in technology inputs, not in electricity. And you were mentioning reciprocity. What should the US or the granting government do? If we are talking about an actionable subsidy, there are two remedies. Either you withdraw the subsidy, or you have in some way to address the adverse effects, to remove them, to ameliorate the negative effects of the subsidy. In that instance, hypothetically, you might ask the granting country to grant the subsidy also to the other constituency, to the competitor, but of course that's merely hypothetical. It's a scenario that sometimes you have hypothetically when you're talking about subsidies and national treatment under the GATS. So I don't really know whether I addressed your question or whether you had something more specific, because I'm sorry I didn't get it.
No, I think you addressed the point. I mean, it's just the question of...
Microphone. I think you might have to turn yours off.
Yeah, I think you addressed the main issue, but I just wanted to get a clarification of how trade law should then look at these issues. I mean, you have country conditions that are different. That's why probably countries might have to give different levels of subsidy to electricity produced in different countries. Now, when you have an import of electricity, just because the electricity has to compete with your domestic electricity, should you give both types of electricity the same conditions of competition, which means you extend the subsidy to that electricity? Or would you say, well, maybe Canadian electricity is produced under completely different conditions, and so maybe it doesn't need to, benefit from another US subsidy that is provided. But then the other thing is also that consumers have different rates of choice. I mean, rates of which at which they can pay for that electricity. When you're talking about a consumer in India, he or she would probably less price for the same renewable electricity as say consumer in Japan. So would you then have to also take that into account because you have to compete in the same market for electricity? Thanks.
Well, in terms of remedies, again, you either remove the adverse effects, and this is something which is not possibly easy, or you extend the subsidy to possible competitor. But again, this is even more difficult. I would say that basically that's it. That's what trade law allows you. It's the types of the leeway that you have is quite limited. Of course, one question which might be puzzling from an economic point of view, but not from the legal point of view maybe, is that you may have subsidies that produce the same effects or similar effects, local content as we suggest, and production subsidy and the legal treatment is completely different. And again, if this is correct, that they have similar effects, then the suggestion, strategic suggestion to the granting government is, okay, try to grant a production subsidy rather than a local content subsidy, because that one is, the treatment is more lenient. With respect to the interesting question of whether, I have depicted the current rules as barriers, and in particular I was suggesting that possibly, assuming that local content subsidy might be useful in certain scenarios, you might think about downgrading the current discipline and being more generous with that. You refer to Article 3, and you said, okay, let's look at the whole issue from the other perspective, as rules, subsidy rules, or a sufficiently strong subsidy discipline as an enabler of trade. So, in as much as the subsidy discipline are prohibiting local content subsidies, and local content subsidies are an obstacle to innovation or to trade, well, these rules are good. Well, what could I say? I could say that if this is a premise, yes, the discipline is correct, in the sense that providing the remedy of prohibition is already something which is good. In any case, the possibility of testing whether the local content subsidy is really contributing to innovation or not, and so whether the local content requirement is not that bad, it's something which might be tested subsequently in the legal analysis, which means, hypothetically, under the necessity test of possibly Article 20 of the GATT. I don't know whether I've been sufficiently clear, whether I'll answer your question or...
Economic costs, but potentially environmental costs. But I guess
on the basis of your premises, of course, the conclusion would be that a strict discipline, particularly in this respect with local content requirements, is something which is desirable. So we should not change the rules, and local content is different from this perspective. From the various arguments that you put forward, is completely different from a production subsidy. So it's good to have such a very strict discipline in the first place. Having said that, if you accept, that reality may be very complex, in a particular litigation context, you might always have the possibility, if you assume that you can apply Article 20, that a member trying to defend the local content requirement might try to prove that in the particular circumstances this measure, this local content requirement itself, I'm not saying the fit, but the local content might be something which is necessary. Of course, this is very, very difficult, but I'm just thinking about a case that now has been closed, the China wind case, and this argument was put forward by Rob House in a conference at Columbia University, that China might have had a plausible, environmental even argument to plead a good Article 20 defense for that local content requirement. Going back to the first point, on the basis of your factual and economic assumptions, yes, in that case, the subsidy discipline is correct in so far as it prohibits local content requirements, because local content requirement would not be very much conducive to innovation, but they would create an obstacle to trade. I hope I have answered your question.
Domestic content requirements impose a cost on domestic producers, which means a higher amount of money spent per environmental result. So you can argue, and I think you are arguing, that it's really an anti-environmental sort of a regulation, and incidentally probably would have trouble justifying itself under Article 20 if Article 20 did apply to the SCM. I think the only new thing that green industrial subsidies bring to this kind of an argument is the possibility that one could argue that domestic local content requirements were such a powerful tool of industrial development that they encouraged the growth and successful growth of a green infant into a global innovator and competitor, which had overall a net beneficial environmental result at the end of the day. Now, this is obviously a difficult empirical question. It goes back to the excellent presentation by Richard on what works and what doesn't work in terms of industrial policy. I think an open question, and argues one of my favorite arguments for the need for trade policy to be based heavily on what we do know from economic empirical evidence.
Multilateral, I think, regimes are effective when they talk about multilateral cooperation. So, you know, the Nagoya Protocol really was useful, and I think to some extent the UNFCCC has been. The question is, are they effective when they impose constraints on policy space, especially for developing countries? And there, I think the jury is still out to some extent. So, I think to I think the short response to your question is, if we focus multilateral regimes on international cooperative arrangements, for example, then perhaps that would be a better way to go, especially in the current context where we are facing severe challenges arising from climate change. On the, I think the question raised by our colleague from Australia, my sense about it is, as Aaron pointed out, domestic local content requirements have been useful in the past in some countries, and I guess the response to that is it really is context specific, and then the context would also depend on the objective of the government that would be imposing that local content requirement. If, for example, it has industrial development objectives which it wishes to pursue in terms of getting upscaling the level of technologies that it can produce by, or its industries or enterprises can produce by themselves, by having a greater share of content in any products that are produced, then that is a factor that needs to be taken into account. One could say that yes, the logic of availing of cheaper environmental products by eliminating local content requirements is logical and has economic rationality behind it. But when you factor in the development aspect of it, and perhaps the desire of governments as part of their overall strategic industrial policy to improve their ability to produce those products themselves and perhaps eventually compete at the international level in the markets for those products, then perhaps local content requirements will have something to say for itself as a positive aspect. Perhaps one area that could be looked at seriously, I don't know if it's in the context of the current WTO negotiations, but perhaps something that still might be worthwhile to look at, is the ideas that are contained, for example, in paragraph 10.2 of the implementation-related issues decision that came out from Doha in 2001. This paragraph speaks of a proposal that was submitted by developing countries to treat measures which are implemented by developing countries with a view to achieving legitimate development goals, such as regional growth, technology research and development funding, production, diversification and development, and implementation of environmentally sound methods of production as non-actionable subsidies. If I remember correctly, the last time implementation related issues were treated as a serious negotiating item in the WTO was back in 2005, I think, and so it has dropped off the agenda, or not really been figuring much in the agenda. But I think this idea speaks for itself as well, because it's something that might be useful in developing country context. The other element in that particular paragraph, which might be relevant to the discussion still, is that the last sentence of that paragraph says that during the course of the negotiations, the Doha round, members are urged to exercise due restraint with respect to challenging the measures that developing countries might be implementing. Given that the Doha round has not yet concluded, perhaps this due restraint clause should still be looked at seriously. And I'm speaking again in the context, for example, of the challenge to China's efforts to promote its renewable energy industries, which unfortunately met with some criticisms from other WTO members, which is rather unfortunate, because that was a clear example of a developing country trying to upscale through various kinds of measures the ability of that country to produce renewable energy technology. Thank you.
I have to say, I think this is it's the wrong question to be asking, because we don't per se want trade law to treat market failure. Instead, what we're looking for is some kind of policy space which trade law at the moment doesn't give, to give governments the option to treat market failure. So instead, what we have is some kind of negative prohibition on any amelioration of market failure or policies that pertain to those ends. That's all I want to say on that question.
I think what we've been hearing is a lot of discussion sort of in broad theoretical terms. You know, we've got one or two examples out there, but really we're talking about broad theory here. So the question is, to what extent do we have sort of meaningful studies of that are systematic of challenges in WTO law of industrial policies that we would otherwise consider economically efficient? I would assert broadly that probably those studies would show that much of what is undertaken as industrial policy in the developing world simply is below the radar screen. Now this is contrary to Danny Roderick's view. If you remember in his article of 2004, Industrial Policy for the 21st Century, he's got this wonderful annex of about, I don't know, 8 or 10 pages in which he shows how WTO law prevents good industrial policy, right? But when you look at that annex carefully, I should note that this is an economist doing international law, so on Danny's part, actually my interpretation of Danny as well. It doesn't appear to me that those laws really are constraining industrial policy. In Africa, for example, I've worked in 6 or 8 different countries and looked at legislation, and in most of these countries you find what I would say industrial policy running somewhere between 1 and 3% of GDP being spent on industrial policies. In fact, none of this is being challenged in the WTO. So the question is, do we have a literature which is really looking at serious challenges to, you know, what Botswana is doing, or what Rwanda is doing, or what Kenya is doing, or what Mauritius is doing, that would constrain what we would call economically efficient industrial policy? I assert those studies don't exist, and I assert that, moreover, that probably the 100 smallest economies of the world, 120 smallest economies of the world, are inconsequential to the kinds of things we were discussing in terms of constraints. Is the jury still out? This was Weiss's term. No, I don't think the jury's out at all. I think the jury's never been called on this particular question. And do we need, as Luca says, more policy space? Looks to me like we got a lot of policy space, just to be a little contrarian here. Where I think we do have to watch things very carefully, though, is in the area of free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties, and a lot of the situation of negotiations where you have big countries with big markets and a lot of benefits to offer small countries negotiating in an asymmetrical bargaining situation. And in these situations, I think that's where you find the dominant country asking for the end of particular industrial policies that seem to hurt their industry. The United States Free Trade Agreement with Chile, for example, wanted to have access to the insurance industry, which for whatever reason, good or bad, was protected. Okay, that's a kind of an example. I think if we begin to look through those systematically, we would find examples of new legislations internationally contravening what might be economically efficient industrial policy. End of question.
But maybe we don't have a problem if we're underground, and you know the distance between Botswana and Geneva is great indeed. I agree. But Richard, I think practice does suggest that there's a chilling effect that we may not see. You see a lot of that in WTO sessions, for example, which is a bit akin to your situation on FTAs, where you do have, by misunderstanding or by sort of less of candid what would be the noun for candidness? Candidness? Candidity? Canditoria? In any case, the question here is, can we somehow create a better space that is clearer and more gentle? And I think that's what Luca is after, and that's also interestingly, I thought, what David was after. Of course, David is the name, right? Yes.
Indeed, there have been some studies. The World Bank did a study a couple of years ago which showed the egregiously high number of subsidies, large amounts of subsidies going into fossil fuel produced power. I'm delighted to hear about this, the IISD initiative. I think it's really an important way to go. In fact, I think this is if we want to pioneer something and use the subsidies code or whatever instruments out there, I think this is exactly the way to think about it. Second point, I think, is that I would hope that at least the developing countries, the majority of developing countries in the room, leave this panel with the notion that if they want to do green growth industrial policy, they really can. And it's a question of being creative. It's a question of hiring some really smart lawyers to fend off any suits should they come. And I'm not sure about the chilling effect. I'd like to hear examples about that. When I travel around Africa or Latin America or Asia, I don't find any governments telling me that they're not going to do a particular policy because of what's happening in Geneva. Now, I could be wrong, and I think the big countries are a different story, right? Brazil, India, China, these are big games. And yes, they have to be very cognizant. But when you're talking to any country with less than 20 million people, I think you're probably okay and well below the radar screen of Geneva. The more difficult challenge is doing efficient industrial policy.
You perfectly capture what was the main purpose of my presentation, was just try to put a little bit of seed of doubt about the soundness of the current legal framework, and to try to think about a legal framework which is more conducive, maybe theoretically only, but that's already a good start, to a policy space for renewable energy. And this partly links also to the gentleman's claim that we have massive subsidies, the elephant, which is passing through. This is linked to my second practical point I made before, that this is my argument, we have a tacit acquiescence. So everybody's granting a lot of subsidies, bigger or smaller, nobody's challenging them. Maybe it's just, a theoretical issue what I was putting forward, but it might well be that with the future, with a different trend in litigation, it might become maybe only for bigger countries and bigger developing countries also a problem. And then the policy space issue and whether the legal framework is conducive or not to that might kick in. The empirical analysis that you suggest, of course, would be very, very helpful indeed. Thank you.
The other one is with respect to what Charles said. I think the issue of subsidies for fossil fuels is something that, as you know, has been picked up already, including in the G20. And one of the issues that have come out is how would you ensure that any reforms in these subsidies do not adversely affect the access of the poor to energy, especially in developing countries, where the question is actually improving energy access rather than cutting down on energy consumption. And part of the problem there is that a lot of the fossil fuel subsidies, as I understand it, are still being done in developing countries. So again, there's this issue of how do you differentiate the impact of any reforms. The other related point to that is in the climate negotiations, there are now suggestions, not coming from countries themselves, but suggestions coming from NGOs and other sort of like actors in the climate negotiations that essentially are suggesting that perhaps you could look at reforms in fossil fuel subsidies as one of the sources for potential climate financing, shifting money, the $200 billion, to climate financing. But again, that again raises the issue of if much of these subsidies are coming from developing countries, then are you then essentially asking developing countries to fuel their own climate action, to finance their own climate actions? Thank you.
I'll make three very quick points. One pertains to Richard's comment question. and also at the same time the gentleman from the Indian mission. Even though a lot of the subsidies that go on are currently unchallenged, this really needs to be looked at in a temporal context. In the next 10 years, the growth in this industry is going to be massive. And really what will drive challenges in the WTO if the rules stay the same is this economic interest. So there's no reason now to say that because things haven't come, they won't come in the future, for a start. And I do buy into the idea that there could be a good degree of cooling on government subsidies, maybe not now, but maybe prospectively if things don't change, which will be very, very hard to quantify and indeed to find out. So that's why I push for something to be done now. Second, regarding non-carbon subsidy figures, I urge you, like Aaron said, there's some people at IISD, especially Peter Wooders, so I urge you to go and talk to Peter sitting over there, the chief economist, especially when he's having coffee or lunch. These useful times like that, because he's an authority on this. And finally, Hannes, thank you for your dose of political realism. I'm aware that there would be big problems with this, and indeed it's something that both me and Aaron are trying to finesse. So co-author in this paper, which will come out towards the end of the year. But really today what I wanted to do is try and push a few ideas, try and give a solution that might not have been thought about before, and it's something you can go back and modify to what you think might be politically feasible. Thank you.